Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whiskey podcast. I am joined this day, as I am all days, with my good friend, my business partner, by my good friend, by my business partner. Not with, because that would make us conjoined, and we are not that. The dear Mr. Jason Johnston Yellen. Hi, Jason.
Hello there. It's lovely to be here. The sun is splitting the blue sky
right.
in Virginia.
Yeah.
Our high is 85, which if you're in other climates is almost 30 centigrade.
Oh, wow.
And I am a happy boy. I'm wearing shorts. I'm wearing a T-shirt. I'm wearing my Backwoods Distilling T-shirt here.
There you go.
And always happy to represent our friends in Yakandanda. And yeah, you're going to get a good version of me today. I'm happy. I'm a happy boy.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Every episode, it's like, here's another shit version of Jason.
Yep.
But today, we're good.
When it rains, you don't get the best of me. You just don't. And today, this isn't even my A game, Joshua. This is my A+ game. Oof. You're getting my A+ game today. So enjoy it, because who knows what the weather will be doing the next time we record.
So here's the thing. I've got the sun splitting the heavens here in Connecticut. I've got 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which I want to say is around 25 Celsius, somewhere around there.
I'll put us in that window, yeah, plus or minus.
I woke up to an issue, though, Jason.
Well, a man of your age, that'll happen.
I got squirrels that have infested
I got squirrels.
Some people get crabs. I get squirrels. That's the weird thing. I know there's like a salve for that, but you know.
I got squirrels. Yeah, there's an ointment, yeah. Rub it on your squirrels twice daily.
So actually, if I'm being honest, I've been waking up to squirrels every morning because what they've done is they've built homes beneath my solar panels. And yeah,
hashtag humble brag.
They're living large, and so as are we. And so, you know, we would hear this cacophony of just little, you know, the pitter patter of little feet on our roofs.
Are you squirrel grandparents? Is that what you're telling me here?
So squirrel parents comes into play here. So I started noticing little mommy squirrels and daddy squirrels and little baby squirrels, like you know where my office is in my house, right?
I do. Listeners don't, but I do.
Right? So there's the window that goes out, and then there's this kusaberry tree that's in front, which is a Korean dogwood. Okay. And fwa fwa fwa. And
this is just a litany of hashtag humble brags. I'm curious to see where this is going.
And I would sit at my desk and I'd look out at this tree and I would watch squirrels go up the tree with like mouths full of nest building materials. Go easy, Jason. This is a family.
Stuffed cheeks full of berries.
Twigs and berries.
Cool.
And they would go up, you know, up the tree to our roof to make little squirrel homes. And so 2 mornings ago, so it wasn't this morning, it was 2 mornings ago, it was just like a circus of squirrels. So I said, fuck it, dude.
I think that's what a collection of squirrels is called, is a circus.
It's a circus of squirrels.
A murder of crows.
Yeah, exactly.
A gaggle of geese. A circus of squirrels.
So I got some like branch trimmers, and I just trimmed all of the branches that would allow access to our roof with these squirrels.
Such a dad response. Well, that's how you access the roof? Well, let me show you what I'm going to do. Goodbye, roof access.
And I felt fantastic until Jason this morning.
They built a set of ladders.
Well, so they can get down.
Oh no! Oh no!
I know
this is like a fledgling falling from a nest.
Well, no, because they can jump onto the tree. They just can't. It seems as if they can't jump off of the tree onto the roof, but they can jump off of the roof onto the tree.
Understood.
And I saw squirrels with like little mommy nipples And I'm thinking like, oh, I'm tearing apart these families. I feel like such a monster.
Because you are 100%. Am I here to absolve you? Like, is that I don't have that.
Yeah,
in
I
me.
was hoping you'd like, let me know I'm still doing the right thing.
So here's what we would have done.
Right? What would you have done?
Is you need to wait for the season to end. Like, you have to just suck it up for the season. If you're going to be crunchy granola types like you and me, there's people out here listening to this who can't believe how soft we're being right now.
Like,
but if you're crunchy hippie granola types, like you, right? Yeah. Like you and me, and my wife and your wife, is you wait for the season to end. You wait for them to, have their births, make sure all of them can jump, and then you trim the tree. When you trim it in the middle, you get to live with what you're currently living with, which is, you've separated them at the border. And
that's not good.
Yeah. This is going to be awesome when you put a ladder against your house so they can get back onto your roof.
That's how I feel right now. I'm like all I can think is that little mommy squirrel went off to get some food for baby, and now she's fucked.
That's yeah. I live with a wildlife ecologist. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I can't tell you a happy story that ends well.
Do not tell Tamara I did this. Don't tell Tamara. She'll be mad at me forever.
Oh, I've already. While you were talking, I just texted you. That's why when you saw my phone in my hands, I was just texting Tamara. You won't believe what this cruel man has done. Tamara's in the house crying right now. It's just a pox has befallen you. Yeah. Yeah, that's a bummer, man.
Yeah.
I wish you'd contacted the wildlife ecologist to see what to do.
Yeah, what do I do? She's like, well, whatever you do.
Don't. Whatever you do not set fire to your roof. Whatever you do. Yeah. At the end of the day, here's what else you could do.
All right. Oh.
I have no other ideas.
Oh, you don't have an idea. Okay. All right. Well.
How accessible is your roof to yourself?
Not very. I mean, even if I could get up there, I'm frightfully frightened of heights.
Connecticut man ends up in hospital after trying to rescue squirrel. What's a squirrel youngster called? I always want things that you don't expect to be called pups are called pups, and so I think a baby squirrel is called a pup.
I
don't think that's correct.
That sounds good.
I don't think that's
kittens,
correct. But kittens, squirrels are having kittens. Yeah. Local man falls off roof rescuing squirrel young who he separated from squirrel parents.
Checks out. It absolutely checks out.
And I think ending in hospital is best case scenario. I really worry about what the actual headline would read, given that once again, I know the height of your roof and I know what you would be landing on when you come off said roof.
Well, the article would be in the obituary. It wouldn't be on the front cover.
Exactly that. But you'd brought the podcast down enough. I didn't also want to go with your death.
All right. Well, let me change tact here.
Polly, do we have some whiskey to talk about today?
Well, I definitely want to talk about whiskey, but I've got a question for you. When's the last time, since our mailbag episode, when's the last time you remember receiving an email with questions into info@singlecastnation.com or questions at onenationunderwhiskey.com? Yeah,
we've gone a little dry. Yeah. I don't know if by people I mean listeners, thank you dear listeners. I don't know if our dear listeners don't think we're accessible anymore. I would hate for that to be the case. We're still two jamokes with a pad cost. Drop us a note. Yeah. Have all the questions been answered? Are there no more questions
maybe that's
left?
It. Maybe there are no more whiskey questions to be answered.
Yeah, I don't know. People are welcome to write in, but absolutely, even James Foster, from whom we used to hear all the time. I don't know if James Foster just felt like he was writing in too much. But yeah, it's gone a little quiet. Please drop us a note.
Yeah, drop us a note because we love hearing from people.
Otherwise, Joshua has to tell us about squirrel death of his own doing. So, if we just had an email in that opening segment today.
Because, well, part of the reason I ask is I was thinking to myself, what, I always like a little bit of an intro. And then I liked what you started doing. You started front-loading some of the emails. And
those were nice.
Wouldn't it be nice to have an email? We don't have an email. I'm going to talk about slowly murdering squirrels that decide to, build a house on my roof.
Let's throw in the word inadvertently, right? Slowly and inadvertently killing squirrels.
Is that like squirrel slaughter?
It's more like inadvertent squirrel slaughter.
Inadvertent squirrel slaughter.
Yeah. And the reason that I had started front loading was we were behind on our emails.
We were, right?
And now we're not. So we're all caught up.
So
maybe nobody expects us to be caught up. Maybe that's the problem.
Maybe that's it. Well, listeners, we are officially caught up. So if you have any questions about whiskey, about squirrels, wildlife ecology, you name it, info@singlecastnation.com, questions at onenationunderwhiskey.com. And the questions don't have to be just for us. Could be for Jess, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Could be for Steve, who
absolutely
brought on before as well. So don't think they have to be directed to us. If you've got questions, send them our way. We will happily get them answered for you.
Yeah. Dear Steve, what's the hardest part of working with these two jamokes? That was good. That was a good question you asked. That was definitely stronger than squirrel death. Inadvertent squirrel death.
Firstly, thank you. Secondly,
you're batting 500 right now. You're a Hall of Famer.
Basically, what does that mean? I know 300 is a perfect score in bowling. Is it the same for football, like you're talking about?
There's a portion of our audience absolutely loving this. Keep going. Keep going. I'm not even going to answer your question.
Listen,
Keep going.
I'm about to get an RBI with this next one here. We have on the podcast today someone we've really wanted to have on for some time, and for reasons I can't think of, we just never had him on. But here he is.
Well, I'm going to give a reason.
Okay.
He is always incredibly busy. And that's not to say that we're not. But when we're in the business of interviewing people for a podcast, we make the time. Like, it's part of our job, right? We're busy people, but it's part of our job.
Yep.
For Chris, he's a busy person, and being interviewed is not part of his job.
Correct.
And so he was always busy. Our dates did not align. We would work at it for a couple of months. Everyone would just kind of throw their hands in the air, and then we'd let it lie for a year.
Yeah.
And we'd circle back again.
Yeah.
So, he's a terrific, terrific fella, and having a chance to talk with him in depth, even the hour wasn't long enough to talk with him in depth.
Nope.
There are definitely topics that we have tabled that we can return to discussing with Chris in the future. But it was such a pleasure. And we say this often. In knowing Chris for as long as we have, this interview was just shooting the shit with a friend.
Yeah. Yep.
And we always pride ourselves. We always pride ourselves on our listeners being welcome flies on the wall to an industry conversation. This time, we invite them to be flies on the wall of three buddies catching up about whiskey and where they've been and what they've been up to and what they're seeing and hearing and learning and wanting to present to people. It was brilliant.
There you go. I could not have said it any better. Let's hand it off to you, me, and Chris Riesbeck of Found North. Chris Riesbeck, it is so exciting to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
I am incredibly appreciative to be here. I am I've always wanted to say this. I am a longtime listener, first-time guest.
Hey, welcome.
How long have we known each other?
Oof.
I knew you.
Yeah. No one said there would be a
No,
quiz.
I can certainly, I can't pinpoint the exact moment. And obviously, Jason, I would have met you via Joshua, I would imagine. But Josh, I know for a fact that we met while you were still in the manufacturing industry, entirely unrelated, if memory serves correct, to the whiskey industry at that time. So use that as the math and go from that point.
Oof.
Gosh, that's a long time.
Well, yeah. I mean, I joined Impex Beverages almost 10 years ago now. So let
shame it didn't last.
Shame it didn't. That's a different podcast. And so at least 10 years, probably closer to 12.
Yeah.
And just, again, for my own edification, you've been living in Connecticut that whole time.
I have been. Based on the amount that I've traveled for some of my roles, I would argue that I've just sort of kind of touched down here at times. But yes, certainly according to Connecticut state taxes, I have lived here for at least 12 years.
I bring this up because, we've known each other for the 12-ish years or so, and we have yet to have any kind of meetup or meeting or bumped into one another in Connecticut. It's always been in every other state.
100%. I am not sure that I or you physically exist when inside the state of Connecticut simultaneously. For what it's worth, listeners, there might be a rumor going around that we are actually one person because we have never been physically seen in this state simultaneously.
I can tell the listeners right now I am watching one human being speaking in a Joshua Hatton voice and the same human being speaking in the Chris Riesbeck voice. And I hope I'm not giving the game away in this episode.
Way to break the fourth wall, dude. Way to break it.
Wow.
Well, and then I would have met you. I think it was one of those names that was mentioned to me. If you see Chris Gordon McPhail, make sure you say hi. Mm-hmm. And then I don't think we actually met until perhaps at a Jubilee.
I know for a fact we met at Chicago Jubilee. I'm almost positive.
Huh. Oh.
And I remember that show. One, I remember that show because it was a great show. But two, I remember it was one of the coolest venues ever for a show. That place was awesome. I remember really liking the venue in general, which if you care about, if you walk out of a show, and anyone that's in the industry will appreciate this, you walk out of a show and you're like, man, that venue was cool. It was a good show. And you're not like, I need to get to a bar if possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. I miss those shows. Yeah, that was a great venue. Well, here we are, right? We've known each other for, let's call it a dozen years. And we met you first when you were with Gordon McPhail, and then, of course, through the Westland years. And now you've got this new role with Found North and our friends Zach and Nick Taylor. And so I'd love to get there eventually, because we definitely want to talk about that, because there's a lot of exciting things going on, including a new 15-year-old that I've been seeing all across the interwebs. But I'd really love for our listeners to hear your story, because I think you've got a lot to share, and at one time I want to hear about your keeperdom, because you held a record at one point when it came to that. So what's your origin story? How did whiskey happen for Chris Riesbeck?
Yeah, so I was born in Connecticut. Not a ton of people know that, but I was born in New England, born in Connecticut, moved a ton as a kid. My father was in CPG, consumer foods, things like that. And we spent most of what I would describe my formative years living out in the Midwest, so Ohio and Michigan. And it wasn't until my realistically, I remember my parents were like, hey, we're going to move back to the East Coast. And I had 3 weeks left in my freshman year of high school, which was an interesting time to move. So yeah, imagine being I guess, God, I'm too old now to remember exactly, but I think you're like 14-ish when you're a freshman in high school.
Yep.
And
that's it.
Moving there and then being like, oh, sweet, here's a week of school. And then you're not going to know anyone the entire summer, which was interesting. But I graduated from high school out in Connecticut and then immediately went back out to the Midwest. I was a lacrosse player in high school, had an opportunity to play lacrosse in college that I think I lasted for a season and a quarter, if memory serves correct. It was a pretty short stint. I realized almost immediately upon entering college that professional lacrosse was not in my cards. And even more so, aside from that, I really kind of fell in love with the learning style in college where you got to pick what you wanted to find out, because it is just different. And that the only reason I mention that is because there'll be a point in this where I'll kind of describe how important schooling has been to everything that I've been able to do in this industry. But graduated from a little school out in Ohio, moved back to Connecticut, got a job at a high-end wine bar in Avon, Connecticut, a place called Boss Kitchen Wine Bar. It's not there anymore, but a great spot. And that is important because it's where I met my now wife, which is pretty cool. So it's a major milestone in my life. But I had an opportunity. I ran a small wine program at the wine bar. And then pretty quickly, a couple of months after being there, I had one of my sales reps from one of the distributors was like, you seem to really like this. Would you ever want to get into, wine sales or spirit sales? And at the time, I had a degree in biomedical ethics. My undergraduate degree was in biomedical ethics. And I thought I wanted to go into hospital administration or pharmaceutical sales. And I had gone on a bunch of interviews, and I was getting through these interviews finding like I just genuinely didn't know the science the way biochem or, organic chem majors knew the science on stuff. And as much as I thought I would have been a great salesperson, the amount they would have had to have punched me up to get the science start going would have been significant. So I took this job and then pretty quickly kind of proved to have an acumen for it. And within 7 or 8 months of working at Gallo, which that was where I cut my teeth. My first job was with Gallo. I got an offer to work for a fine wine wholesaler in Connecticut called Slocum and Sons, and had about a 4.5-ish year stint there. Started as a salesman, became a key account manager, regional manager, and then their spirit sales manager, and loved every minute of it. And at the tail end of my time at Slocum and Sons, I had an opportunity to go down to Whiskey Fest at the Marriott Marquis in New York City. And I had a supplier at the time, a guy by the name of Sean O'Donnell, who worked with Phillips Distilling, who he knew a guy who was at the importer for Gordon & MacPhail, which is a wholesaler in Massachusetts called Martinetti. And, he was like, I think you'd be great for this. He's like, why don't you put in for it? And he sent my resume in and almost immediately, got a call from them. I sat down with two guys, Gary Kymack, Matt Shivian, who I still to this day consider some of the most influential people in my career. And they pitched that was the national brand ambassador for Gordon & MacPhail. We were an importer, but really in name alone because we were exclusive on Gordon & MacPhail at the time. And it felt like one of those jobs where, listen, you're a Martinetti employee, you work for Classic Imports, but your marching orders and what we're trying to do are coming from Gordon & MacPhail. So it was one of those where you had someone that you could rely on locally to ask good questions for. And frankly, an industry-leading back-of-the-house functionality capability through Martinetti. But I also had the freedom to I had a hunting license. I was given bag of samples and a hunting license, and they said, go and do and conquer. And I had as much fun as anyone could have in a job for about 6 years there. I loved every single minute. We hired some tremendously talented people to work with me at the time while I was there, but it was just unbelievable. Getting to see the genesis of Ben Romick become a brand again, getting to see Gordon & MacPhail really grow into what I thought at the time and still believe to this day was really the first majorly influential independent bottler in America. I mean, this would have been timeline wise, this is 2010 when I started there. So, I mean, you think about that.
Oh, wow.
Independent bottling, it wasn't that it was an unknown. I think that's a really important thing to lay out. People knew what independent bottlings were, but it was a very, very small subsect of the industry that got what it was. I will never forget this. Year one-ish of being out in the market, I was at a festival pouring our Gordon and MacPhail bottlings of Glenlivet, and a woman came up to me at a table and basically accused me of selling counterfeits because her son worked for Glenlivet, the wholesaler in the US. And I was just like, this is the bar of what we need to sort of surpass to get people to appreciate it. But it was incredible. I have always been the kind of person that found whiskey interesting. My father likes whiskey. My grandfather on my father's side loved whiskey. I always thought it was such a beverage to sit and contemplate. And while I've never been accused of being some great thinker, I've always fashioned myself as a great thinker. And I love the fact that when you drink whiskey with friends or even by yourself, it forces you to reflect on the time that you were in. And I'm not sure there's a lot of things in the world that actually do that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Historical context, people that put it together, for sure.
So
for sure.
With the job with Gordon MacPhail as being your first sort of large spirits job, was there, like, did you understand independent bottling at that point? You usually have to dig in deep to really understand not just what independent bottling is and who independent bottlers are, but how to communicate that in a succinct manner to your customers. So how did all of that work out?
So you have to reverse slightly in my career trajectory and go back to the Slocum days. So when I was at Slocum Sons, we had been acquired by a New York company, Eber Brothers. So Lester Eber, who's no longer with us, but an industry legend, I would argue, owned that company. But it was run by John Slocum, who's still a friend to this day. And at the end, I had mentioned I was the spirits director. Well, one of the things that Slocum has, and I won't get deep into the intricacies of Connecticut law, but Connecticut is what's known as a franchise law. So oftentimes wholesalers will have quote unquote exclusive rights to brands. Well, in this day and age, most of the big distilleries, this is, going back to 2008-ish at this time, most of the big brands already had not only importers assigned, but they had wholesalers assigned in Connecticut. So what we had done is we had looked at that and said, okay, well, where could we find opportunity? And we were very fortunate. We worked with Henry Price at the time. And Price Imports was the importer at that moment of Springbank, of Duncan Taylor, of a handful of other things. And it was this great training because we would go into stores, and Connecticut, thankfully, has a very high-end clientele broadly. We would go into some of these great wine shops in Fairfield, New Haven, and Hartford and say, okay, we have this unique one-off bottling of take your pick, really. And it would be through Duncan Taylor. And I remember the amount people that appreciate really cool things, the amount of Little Mill we sold during some of those years, the amount of Port Ellen we sold through independent. Now you look back and you're like, Jesus, if I had only known. The Rosebank. Rosebank by the cases through independent bottlings. It was just, oh my gosh, it was unbelievable. So I had important detail I probably should have added. I had a massive interest in the independent bottling side of things. Frankly, I laugh because had people pitched me on just a singular distillery job at that point in my life, I'm pretty confident saying I wouldn't have been as interested. I really wanted to be known as a whiskey person and specifically a Scotch person. And I felt that being brand specific would have made that difficult to have credibility across the space in a way that, people often represent, they'll say, well, they're a salesperson or they're a marketing person. Of course, that's their pitch. But for an independent bottler, you're an archivist, you're a librarian. Your job is to share stories that perhaps a brand team doesn't exist to tell that thing. Yes, Gordon and MacPhail has an incredibly vivid and rich history, and the Aladdin's Cave line is accurate. It is a great representation of what they have available to them. But I would imagine if you sat with Ewan or Derek Hancock, who I worked with years ago, Derek would say that the role was for them to keep these stories alive, to tell the story of Mortlock and Linkwood. 2010, Mortlock OBs weren't coming to America. It wasn't, I want to say it wasn't until like, and someone will know better, but I want to say it was like a year or two into us at Gordon and MacPhail when you start to see those distillery bottlings come through at the time for those places. So it was so exciting to tell people like, you've had this whiskey, but you've had it in a blend. Well, now I'm giving you the slice and the middle slice so you can really appreciate how wonderful these things are, because I at this point, I'm ashamed to say I probably don't even know the exact number, but let's say in the 110 plus distilleries that exist in Scotland, the reality is that more often than not, people know 40, the sort of big 40, and maybe it's really the big 20. You start getting to the newer places, it really shifts. And I found that to be such a wonderful responsibility. I not to sound hyperbole driven, but like, it was an honor to do those things. It felt like you were doing something for the industry and not just something that was self-serving at the brand level.
I have a question for you right along those lines, Chris, which is, Josh and I talk all the time. We said this just the other night in front of the wonderful Drammers group. But when we were just kicking off 2011, 2012, so you talking 2010 here really spurred me along. Back at that time, we would be in front of a room and who has heard of Aaron? Nobody. Who's heard of Kilchoman? Nobody. Who's heard of Ben Riach? Nobody. And I'm curious for you around your time of coming into this. Do you recall similar moments? Do you have similar examples that now people fall over themselves for examples of it? But do you remember a harder pitch back in the beginning?
And it's absurd. So I want to lay the groundwork that this is going to sound completely impossible, but this actually happened. The year I started, we had 3 different bottlings of Ardbeg. And because they were sub 10 years old, I remember people pushing back being like, oh, it's not 10 years old. And again, now I look and I'm like, every once in a while, I love looking at the auction sites to see some of the stuff that I've sold in the past to see what it's. Some of those things now are hundreds of dollars a bottle because they were, my God, we used to have this. It was like this fluorescent green label that Ardbeg had back when in the old Connoisseur's Choice pack. And man, those whiskeys were unbelievable because from my perspective and my palate, and obviously this is so differentiated for everyone, but I love Young Isla. I think Young Isla shows a fruitiness. Old Isla shows a depth of flavor that is unique, and I love that, but you pay for the pleasure. But there is something about the young tropicality of younger Isla whiskeys, especially at higher strength. Like, I would take sub 10-year-old Kalila all day. It's hard for me to get more excited over something like that. But I remember at the time being like, it's such a perfect way of thinking of it. Like, I remember being like, this whiskey is too good for this to be this difficult. And all it took was just this sea change moment. And it took time. I can distinctly remember there was an issue of, and God, I think it was still called Malt Advocate at the time, where it was the team from Glendronach when Billy Walker acquired them. And I remember that feeling at a consumer level. So this would have been prior to me joining G&M, but right really on the cusp of shifting. And I remember people starting to get super excited about, like, I've never heard of Glendronach. And you got that liquid out and people were like, this is fantastic. But it's been, and you of all people, the two of you have seen this. It's the evolution of consumer journey in this country is not fluid. It's staccato. And I think that's a good, like, it's like, oh, it's just getting better and better. It feels like there are times where it's a small step, and it feels like there are times where it is a giant leap. And occasionally you can get caught off guard by that. I go to festivals now. I'm sure when I see people lining up to taste things like Torveg or M&H, I'm like, oh yeah, this is fantastic. I couldn't have imagined those days 10-ish, 15-ish years ago.
Yeah, I don't think any of us could have. It's 10 plus years ago, everything was about ultra high age statements, the big single malt names, and, to a larger degree, Johnny Blue. And now with all of the various New World distilleries and Jim Swan distilleries and the Ardnamurcans and, like you said, Torvegs of the world, people are approaching whiskey in a way that we hadn't early on. It really is a different world than it once was.
Yeah, I was saying it just to somebody the other day. When we launched, we had a 4-year-old Kilchoman, and more than one person would say, like, that's too young. That's not correct. That needs to be 8. Best case they would say, oh, that's all right. Could you imagine it at 8? I'm certainly with you, like young Islas, young rugged Islas, 4 years old and ex-bourbon. Yes, please. And then we reached that point, 4 years, 6 years in, where you couldn't keep people in young Islas. We did a 5-year-old Lafroig, a 6-year-old Lafroig, single-digit Kalilas. It's a very different place.
It's been fun to watch the evolution. I can only imagine what we will see over the next. I mean, obviously, the three of us have gone through the rise of bourbon in this country in a way that I never would have anticipated this.
Yeah, never.
I would have thought Scotch was going to be king till the end of days in this country, and clearly, from a volume perspective, yeah, it wasn't. But the reality is that bourbon has entered a moment of popularity from it's everywhere. And I think that's a good thing because it's forcing people to expand their palate horizons and try different things. But I also think that there is, I mean, obviously this is self-serving. When I had the opportunity to join Westland after being at Gordon MacPhail for a number of years, one of the things that I found so appealing was one, I got to keep being a malt guy, which I firmly was at the time, and probably to a degree still love malt as much as anything. But I wanted to be a part of innovation in an industry that I don't think there is very much innovation in. I think there is a huge amount of experimentation. I think it is very easy to assume that experimentation and innovation are the same thing. I'm not sure that I would agree with that all the time.
I like that. That's a very good ponderable.
I think you can do things to a barrel. You can try different barrels. But the reality is the core concept of you are finishing, that's experimentation. That is not innovation.
No.
It doesn't make it less important.
We're going to bring this up to James Saxon when we see him. We're going to put this, because John Glazer comes to mind immediately, right? Compass Box. That's innovation. Right?
I would agree.
Sure they're experimenting behind the scenes, but innovation gets released. And so James Saxon there. So I'm writing this down, and I never write anything down.
I'll take it.
You brought up Westland, and I want to talk about Westland, but just to put things within a time zone. I remember when you became, here we are, 3 keepers of the Quake.
This is a very cool moment. I've just realized 3, and also 3 relatively youngish keepers of the Quake.
Oh, well, thank you, sir. You can come back anytime.
But
you were what, 12, 13 when you became keeper?
I was 16 and a quarter. No, I was keepered in October of 2014, if memory serves correct. I would have been the 2014. Wow. At the time, I would have been 30. Forgive me, my wife is yelling from the background. It was April of 2014. And I am, if memory serves correct, I was 31 years of age at the time. I might have been 32. No, I would have been 31 because I would have turned, every year I turn a year older in May, it turns out. But at the time, I would have been 31 years of age. And there was I believe, and I don't know if this is still the case, forgive me, I would imagine there have frankly been far superior people since my time, but I was the youngest American to keeper of the Quake at the time, which is basically ancient history now. I was not the youngest person in the world, which I'm just going to say this. I'll say this out loud because it's probably worth noting. Anyone that says they don't have an ego in this industry, especially on the sales and marketing side, is flat out. They're just lying. It burned my ass like you could not believe that I wasn't the youngest person in the world, because I'll bet you I could find it. I have a notebook where I wrote, whenever I take a new role, I write a few goals in it. I wanted to win Ambassador of the Year because that to me struck me as something that was voted on by your peers, and I thought it was meaningful. And I wanted to be a keeper of the Quake. And I was fortunate that while I didn't technically win Ambassador of the Year, I took highly commended while I was there, but I became a keeper. And I remember I can be fairly hard on myself at times. I remember I cried when I was told that I was being made a keeper. I was in Boston, and Ewan and Derek were over, and we were at Moo, which, God, fantastic place. I don't know if it's still there, but really great. And they were at the end of this really good meeting, a ton of positivity. And they say, you're going to need to come over in April. Didn't really put two and two together. And they told me that, you've been accepted as a keeper. And I just bawled. I bawled. And because I had worked so hard for it. There were years at G&M. I'd fly 200 and something times a year. I'd spend 180 nights away from a new wife at home. And I did it not for those things, certainly in pursuit of those things, but I did it because I just loved it. Anyone that really knows me, and you two really know me, we have more than just a sort of casual friendship, knows that passion rules my universe. It always has.
Yeah.
I cannot do things that I am not excited about. I might be a great salesman, but I'm a great salesman in things I give a shit about, not things that are just sort of there.
100%.
And I care about whiskey. I care about whiskey because I know how much whiskey can make people come together, and it can make friendships more meaningful. It can make conversations more fluid. It has been the silver lining to so many parts of my life. And I feel really grateful, honestly. I feel really grateful because there's a million things in a lifetime that can change the outcome every day. And whiskey has put me on this just unbelievable path. Unbelievable.
That's really cool. Your passion has always led the way, and anybody who's been in a tasting with you or shared a dram with you knows that, whole cloth. Along with Joshua's point here, to turn attention briefly, I definitely want to get onto the new position and the new world in which you find yourself. But I'm curious, coming from the Duncan Taylor world, the Gordon MacPhail world, and that independent bottling world, what single malt Scotch skill set do you think you brought to Westland as an American single malt producer? And what were some of the things you did to push that category forward?
To his great credit, Matt Hoffman, speaking about Matt Hoffman, what made Matt so incredible was that Matt trusted in us to go out and spread the gospel. And he wanted to be involved in the way that we wrote the word, but he wanted it to sound authentic. There are a lot of times at places where the brand will say, no, this is the lexicon, or this is the language, this is the vocabulary, the vernacular.
Sure.
And they can't deviate from it. And at Westland, everything was new. Steve Hawley and Matt and I would sit in a room and we'd work on things, and no one took the credit. It was shared amongst the team. What I brought to Westland, I think, was a commitment to malt. And I had credibility in the space that was, this is a guy that has tasted some of the best single malts that were available in the universe at the time, right? That was just what I got to do. That was the blessing of working in a place like G&M. And I think me coming into Westland, even though Westland didn't need it because the whiskey was incredible, what it gave people was like, here is a person that is a well-known person speaking on Scotch that sees American single malt as not only deserving of attention, but what we didn't ask permission. We just went and did. And that was, when I tell you it was fun, I look back on Westland. Westland was not only some of the most happy days of my life, but some of the most incredible friendships. Steve Hawley and Matt Hoffman, if they needed me, I'd be on a plane tomorrow. Scott Sell and Phoebe and the entirety of that team, Tyler and Carrie, there were just so many wonderful people there. And we got to hire some great folks that work with me on the commercial activation side of the business. And, we went through an acquisition together. You become, the foxhole term gets overused, but you've gone through so many things together. It just makes you tighter and tighter. But those early days of Westland were just incredible because the liquid was so damn good. You could see where it was going. What we were doing with roasted malts was such the antithesis to what the sort of static part of the industry was doing. Mm-hmm. And it got people excited. We were hand on heart. We weren't bourbon. We weren't scotch, but we were ourselves. We were, decidedly American was one of the terms that Steve used to use all the time. And I agree. He was right. It was like, we were unabashedly doing what we wanted to do, but showcasing a slice of America in the Pacific Northwest that is just different.
I honestly have goosebumps listening to you say those words. You're so fucking good at what you do. And it's genuine, it's authentic, right? You're still passionate for Westland and you're not there, sadly. But gosh, you still have that passion. You say it so eloquently. Unfair question as a follow-up before we move along here. Do you recall a favourite offering from your time at Westland? Ooh. Something that still sticks in your head? I know it's an unfair question. If something jumps up.
Can I caveat and do two? And I'll do the one that I remember the most and the one that I liked the most.
Of course.
Okay. The one I remembered the most, because it was within the first sort of X number of months of me joining the team at Westland, was Garyana launch. It was 2016. I've never been so excited in my life for a launch, because you have to remember now, when I came to Westland, it was this shift, right? It was, okay, you've gone from being the archivist librarian of a category to being a representative of a physical place that existed. Like, people could go to I guess you could technically go to G&M, but you could go to Westland. You could see how it was made. And we owned the process part and parcel. So Garyana was like a very meaningful, important thing for me. But I was really actively involved with the Colere project because that first one came out while I was there. And I just remember it was just that whiskey was so important, I believe, to the way that we consider grain. And it's not only its development of flavor, but the respect that we need to show a raw material that I think is entirely maligned by an industry at this point, because we tend to, unfortunately, think of mash bills where it's like this static thing, but we don't often consider the singular grain. And not only is malt an incredible thing that gives off just enormous loads of variant flavor, but we were doing it with malt that just wouldn't exist in any commodity system at all. Like, people just wouldn't have considered. I mean, it was just, we were doing something that was just, it still does. God, it still feels this way. It felt like we were doing work that I hope people will remember many years from now.
Yeah, that's fair. That's very fair.
The whole time I thought you were going to say it was Bold Smooth. The whole time.
Oh man, I should have come in with the hot take of Bold Smooth Inferno 1 and 2 and just been like, there it is.
Right.
They make an incredible 50-50 cocktail.
The most fun release by a billion. Oh man, I can't even say by a billion miles. There were two that really stand out as fun releases, though, which was Sport Dram was the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life.
Yes.
Those videos, if you've not seen those, were just insane. And then I remember we were, the way that those came up, it's pretty collaborative in terms of like everyone gets to throw in ideas and then Steve kind of goes to the lab and strengthens it and punches them up. But Celebrious, everyone's their own celebrity influencer with the mirror label. I mean, if that's not apropos of 23 and 24, nothing in this industry is.
The Celebrious, that was my ringtone. It was Steve Hawley singing Celebrious. That was my ringtone.
I mean, it is hard not to look. I mean, again, people won't be able to see this, but like the grin on my face recalling these things is like, it's just, I mean, some of those moments at Westland were just like, you look back, my God, they paid us to do these things.
Yeah, right.
just to put a bow on that little conversation, I had the latest Caleri with Anna a few weeks ago in San Francisco, and it was excellent. And so I've actually got some liquid to share with you, Joshua.
Hey!
And so we can have a wee chitty chat on a future episode, maybe with somebody from Westland.
Lovely, jubbly. Looking forward to that. I really liked what you said in the outset, which was if you'd been offered a job early on to focus on a single distillery or a single brand, that wouldn't be interesting to you. And then you did your stint with Gordon MacPhail as the archivist, and then with Westland as a single distillery, single brand, and now here you are with Found North as a single brand, yet you're doing things with whiskey in a way that most people don't even understand. And so it's sort of a two-part question. A, I'd love for you to explain Found North and what you guys are doing with that brand. But B, how has that transition been? Do you miss the old archivist work? Do you feel as if you're able to touch on that a little bit with Found North and these different parcels that you're sort of putting together to create the brand? And I apologize if that second half of the question is coming from a slightly ignorant place. I'll be very honest. Like, I know the brand Found North. I've had some of the whiskeys. The Taylor brothers are just lovely people, but I don't know enough about them, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners don't know enough either. So I wonder if you could answer those two questions.
I'll start with just the sort of the transition from the archivist to the more sort of brand specific. So I distinctly recall there was a point, and it was on a trip to Scotland, being at Benromic and leaving there with a feeling of frustration, not of the thing, but of the trip, because we didn't have the ability to do that in the US. And I saw the way that the team at the distillery interacted and had a closeness, a sort of second family that it's very difficult to have when you're the man on the island. And I would say we had a great ambassadorial team in the US at Gordon MacPhail, some wonderful people that I'm still friends with today, but it wasn't the same as having a physical place that you could bring people to say, see the work that comes from these hands. And it's just different. And getting to do that at Westland was incredible. And it was really sort of a wonderful thing to be able to show, like, from the time I started to the time I left, there was whiskey that was distilled, bottled, and released. That was really cool for me. Like, really, really cool. In Zach and Nick, what I found so incredible. So I've known Nick Taylor for going on probably a decade now, if not longer. Nick was obviously the primary buyer at Gordon's, Gordon's is one of the famous whiskey shops of Massachusetts and notable around the country. And I had met Zach, his brother, Nick. I'd met Nick's brother, Zach, through Nick, obviously. And at the tail end of Westland, when I left Westland for a short stint, I did some consulting for them. And they had kind of described what they were doing, and I found it terribly interesting. I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like, no doubt there's something here. They were sort of in this very early stages of it. I went on and did a short stint at Barrel as the chief commercial officer. And then coming out of Barrel, they had just exploded. Found North went from like a cool thing that the really inner circle whiskey people knew to being like, I don't know when this will get released, but this was the week, if you're hearing this was the week that I sent out all of the allocations for Helldiver First Flight, which is our newest release. And I have never seen my phone. My phone is like literally about to just explode, I'm sure, at this point, because the number of texts and emails, I don't know, 17, 18 years in the industry, I've never seen this level of reaction to something coming out, which is so cool. But what is Found North is the really important thing. So Found North is a Canadian blended whiskey project. So Zach and Nick started it in 21. We're a small team of 5, Zach, Nick, Sammy, Phil, and Mike. And what's so very cool about it is we are not only trying to show a version of Canadian whiskey that I don't believe has really been shown in the marketplace before, but we are trying to do it in a way to really elevate Canadian whiskey, right? There is tremendous quality of distillate being made in Canada at a technical level, purely technical. Yeah. Think of it that way. I am not sure that anyone does it better than the Canadians do, because the sheer volume of it, the consistency, the single grain distillate style requires precision to a degree that is not terribly common across many swaths of the industry. But it is often blended in a way that is designed for a specific price point, right? I think that's a fair thing to say. You think about a majority of the Canadian whiskey brands that Americans would know are considered sort of that sub $50 US price point. And what Zach and Nick identified in an incredible way, and have done just such a tremendous job with it, has been Canadian whiskey can be so much more and will be so much more. And what's so fascinating is to see Found North playing a role in not only giving people a reason to look at Canadian whiskey, but doing it in a way that I'm not sure there has been a producer prior to us that has really embraced this idea of like, we are going to make incredible, mature, rich Canadian whiskey. And we're doing it. And it's been incredibly fun. But one of the main draws of Found North for me was that it's early stage. You know, it's malleable. There are elements to the business that we've been involved. You know, the first month of coming aboard with Found North, we are in multi-day conversations as a team, which is so cool to have everyone's voice heard, of what is the way that we want to create the brand structuring? What is the way that we want people to understand the difference between a batch or our seasons of single barrels versus the high altitude collection? Those are the kind of things that, you know, if you're not in the industry and you're hearing this as someone that's just a fan of the industry, those conversations get made, and then unfortunately in a lot of businesses, they just become like chiseled into stone. And then it's like, no, you can't mess with the sauce because that's what it is. And what Zach and Nick, and frankly, the entirety of the team have been able to do here is come in with an approach that said, this is a living, breathing thing. It is going to continue to grow and evolve over time. Here is what we believe in. We will continue to have a central ethos of quality above all else, following the whiskey, listening to what the blend wants to do. But even more than that, we are going to allow ourselves to grow in a way that allows us to showcase the best parts of what we want to do as a blender, and also the best parts of what Canada does, which is incredible quality distillate.
Yeah. We're taking on new words for the first time, right?
Yeah, right. And you know, in one of the questions that I had, you know, I've got a number of questions percolating in here, but one of them is surrounding words, right? I think when you're talking Scotch whiskey, you have a very specific lexicon. There's very specific words you use and language that you use when you talk about it. And I would argue that changes subtly when you talk about bourbon or when you talk about American single malt versus bourbon. I wonder what it's like talking about Canadian whiskey and how you interact and communicate with people, you know, trying to push that spirit. That is a tremendous question, and it is challenging because the language surrounding Canadian whiskey pre-21, pre-Found North is different than it is now, because people thought about Canadian whiskey purely in a brand perspective, I would argue. They said, this is X brand, this is Y brand. We are trying to broaden the conversation to be about what Canadian whiskey can be and how we want to work with it, which I think is important. You know, when I was at Westland, there were elements of our language that we would cohabitate with Scotch whiskey, I think is maybe the way to think of it, right? There were elements of that. There were certain things where you'd say, well, listen, we want to make sure that consumers are very obviously aware that we are not Scotch. So there is a fine line, but there is also an element of like, you're not going to call it smoked malt when it's peated malt because it's peated malt. And I think that's an important distinction to make. So, you know, if there's an element of, yes, you want a lexicon and a what's the word I'm looking for? You want to create a culture around your brand that allows you to sort of bring it to make it feel unique and distinct.
But admittedly, and this is getting into the comment I made earlier, as American whiskey has just so massively exploded over the last couple of years, it is difficult not to have some elements of that verbiage in there, which transparently on the stage that we work in, the blending side of things, the challenge for us is when you think about non-distilling producers in the United States, which I would consider us a blender. Obviously, we are a non-distilling producer at the pure technical level, but we're really a blender because what we are buying is not quote unquote finished whiskey. And I don't mean that as a slight to any non-distilling producer within the US, because frankly, I think cask selection is a very difficult thing. But transparently, a majority of the liquid that is purchased in the United States on the NDP market are products that for some brands are exactly what they are. They are done. When they come off that still and they're out of the barrel, they're a finished product. The products or the distillate or whiskey that we are purchasing in Canada from a variety of partners are single grain components. They require blending to be turned into something different. Could they be released on their own? Certainly. Would we release them on their own? Absolutely not. That's not what we are trying to do, because we are trying to create something where it is, what's the classic line? The sum is greater than the parts. It needs to be more than that. And I think that's been what's really fun, because we're getting to tell the story of a blender whose canvas is Canadian whiskey.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other questions I had is really...
I'm just sitting out this portion of the interview.
Yeah, Jason, we don't need you around. Well, most people don't understand Canadian whiskey and how the production style is different. When you say single grain, those that do know Scotch whiskey may say, well, that's grain whiskey produced at a single distillery, and there may be a multitude of grains within a mash bill. 90% barley or 10% barley, 90% corn or wheat or what have you. And then here in the U.S., we, especially with bourbon and rye, we talk about mash bills, right? A multitude of grains. But in Canada, when you say distilling a single grain, we're distilling rye, and then we're distilling corn, and then we're distilling malt. And so I wonder, which, like you'd said, they're all just components, right, that you're able to then put together. And so I wonder if you can just put some more leaves on those branches and how that production style differs. Sorry, sure, Jason. Like I said, we don't need you. I'm taking all of your terminology. It is what it is, Jason.
Easy. That's not one of mine.
It's a great question, and it's fair, because you're right. Even in the quote unquote global language of whiskey, single grain doesn't mean single grain, really, right?
Yeah.
So in Canada, to your point, right, a classic production would be something like either 100% corn or 99% corn, 1% malted barley. They are being designed to sort of be laid down as single distillates. The bigger element, the thing that I think is quintessentially much more unique, perhaps not more unique, but certainly more impactful from our perspective, is the fact that a majority of it is matured in ex-bourbon cooperage. Very little of it going into new American oak, certainly what we want to acquire, because especially when you start looking at products that are really in the ranges of what we do, that's sort of like 15-ish plus years old liquid. 15 years in new American oak is an aggressive amount of time. It just is. Sure. Yeah. Stylistically, you can like what you like, and I wouldn't tell anyone it's better or worse, but it requires a certain palate. Because these things have spent a decent bit of their lives in second fill cooperage, the nuance of them as singular components of which we can then blend together into a grain ratio or into an approach of, hey, there's some 20-year-old corn in this one. There's some 18-year-old corn. There's some 14-year-old rye. There's some, we've done an 8-year-old wheated product that came out last year that was incredibly successful. Those things need to be weighed appropriately, not only from the weight of the way that the whiskey feels on the palate, but also the weight of in the sort of the blending environment, right? Is this young corn overpowering the nuance of older corn? Is the young rye overpowering the nuance of the older rye? And I think we can all agree, young corn whiskey has a appreciable difference in profile from old corn whiskey, right? It has consistent viscosity, I would argue, but it has a very different profile overall in the flavors that come out of it. So when we're looking at doing these things, you're to a degree, you're blending in 3 dimensions, right? It's not a matter of saying like, okay, we need 70% corn, 20% this, 10% this. You're blending, having to take into account that you are blending materials that are functionally different from each other from an age perspective, as well as the amount of time they might have then been put into new fill or new wood, because we do want some element of that. I mean, there's no doubt that there is the impact of new wood providing some of that vanillin, that oak lactone, that wood sugar, that hemicellulose, all those really kind of sweet, creamier things. That's a good thing. I would argue, and I think this is something that, frankly, the blending team, which I am not a part of, but the blending team at Found North has done such a wonderful job, is they've been able to ensure that we get elements of that without allowing them to control the grain elements of the whiskey. I will stand up in front of any room in the universe and claim I love whiskey that still tastes like grain. I think one of the saddest things in whiskey is this dependence on whiskey no longer actually tasting like the raw materials that it came from. I'm not saying I want to taste things that taste nothing like corn or only like rye. I want to taste the harmony of those things. Oak needs to be a balancing part of the... Holly and I used to talk about this all the time at Westland. It was like, imagine whiskey in front of you as a table, right? So one of the elements is the cask. One of the elements is the grain. One of the elements is the amount of time it's been there. And one of the elements is fermentation, right? Mm-hmm. Those 4 things, when they are harmonized, you get a balanced whiskey. What I worry we see some of in the industry at this point is such a reliance on barrel to create profile that we've forgotten that you can still have barrel profile. It can just be maybe a bit more subdued, and you can create really fantastic whiskeys. One of the distilleries I'm absolutely in love with right now is Ardent American, because I genuinely believe they very much so appreciate balance. Those whiskeys have wood tone to them, but they also have grain, and there's a fermentation note. It has all of those things that you want to taste in whiskey. It doesn't just taste like this is like 6-ish-year-old malt, and it's got like a ton of oak on it. It's like, I don't want that. I'm sure there is a market for it, but I don't want that. And what I've loved about Found North is that we've identified that, no, old whiskeys don't need to just taste like barrel. Frankly, they can have enormous depth of flavor. You just have to be very cognizant of the wood element.
Yeah, that's beautifully said, and certainly something Joshua and I advocate for constantly. Yeah,
I think it takes people starting in malt to appreciate nuance, and over time expanding out of that. And again, this is my journey, but if I had started in bourbon, I'm not sure that I would appreciate grain forwardness or balance the way I do now, because I started in malt, and we as a collective group know what a old heavy sherry malt whiskey tastes like, and it's not malt often. It can be occasionally, but it's often not malt. But again, I think, Jason, this is why I think you and I both love young Islay, is because they have grain notes to them, and they're for sure, they're vibrant, and vibrancy is an underrated quality in whiskey.
Oh yeah. We used to, as a long-term listener, first-time guest, you will already know this, Chris, but we used to close our episodes with a myth, and then we covered so many we were just retreading the same ground. But with you sitting in front of us today, you've rekindled that old thought, and now that you're in this Canadian whiskey category that we really haven't spent any time talking about in 8 seasons of the podcast, 7 full seasons, right? What is a major Canadian whiskey myth that you think needs serious debunking?
I mean, the obvious one is that everyone thinks Canadian whiskey is cheap. And I mean cheap, not only price and quality, which is just outlandish.
That's what I was just going to ask. If
It's
dollars.
No, it's both.
Quality.
I mean, there is some incredible Canadian whiskey. There's some incredible malt made in Canada. There's incredible corn and rye based distillates made in Canada. Mm-hmm. There are complex, rich whiskeys. I mean, just off the top of my head, I can probably run into the cabinet and be like, I know I've got some Shelter, which is the guys out on the West Coast making some killer malts.
Oh, yeah.
I've got some Glenbarton, which I think is tremendous whiskey. There's no shortage of great whiskey there. I think for some reason, and I'm hoping that we're able to, frankly, unlock this a little bit while I'm at Found North, is we want to establish the premium aspect. The sort of the way that it can, people will go, and obviously I think we've been able to do this in the early stages, and I think it will only continue to grow, is that I want people to seek out Canadian whiskey the way they do the great whiskeys of the world from anywhere else. There was this is such a cliche, but it's so true. There was a time where the three of us could have opened a retail shop and we could have owned as much Yamazaki as we wanted. We could have owned as much Pappy and Yamazaki as we wanted. We could have literally stacked it to the ceilings. We could have built the shop out of it. And that time has passed. And I believe we are in the beginning stages of this moment for Canadian whiskey. And hand on heart, I believe Found North will be a major contributor to that movement.
Nice. You've raised one of the words that I can't just walk past anymore, and it is premium, and I partly because I see brands, really I see conglomerates waving magic wands, and they say that is now premium. I was like, well, how did we get there? How was that decision made? And so, could you? To use Joshua's phrase from this episode, could you put some leaves on the branches of what you mean by premium in this instance?
Yeah, I mean premium in the way that it is in almost every fashion, I guess, and that's not a terribly distinct answer, but in every way, there is an intentionality that exists within premium that does not exist in faux luxury. Faux luxury, anyone can wave a wand and slap a price tag on and put in fancy packaging, and that's faux luxury. Premium, you cannot fake. You can fake luxury to a degree, but you can't fake premium. Premium requires a commitment to craft, and not the version of craft that people misalign that word. I mean a version of craftsmanship, of intentionality in thought, intentionality of action. If I'll use something that's a recent sort of moment for us at Found North, and I'll point to this as being like earning your stripes. If people knew the amount of thought that goes into writing a technical note and the specific language that's used in there, and not just going like, it tastes like red fruit. Okay, great. That's like, there's a strawberry, there's an apple, and a cherry. They're all red. Like, you're going to tell me it thinks like, no, that's ridiculous. That's lazy. It's intellectually lazy. And it is not premium. Premium must touch every facet of your business to be legitimate. And I believe that is what we are going to see the dawn of. And I think there are a handful of producers in the world right now that I think are really getting this to a degree. I think everyone wants to be luxury because luxury is a price point and a margin. The reality is that luxury is not what you're chasing. What you're actually chasing is to be an aspirational brand that people put a premium to. Now that can involve that, like, they think it is worth more, but it's really that they are putting a premium on, I am going to take my time and energy to get this because I believe this is worth owning.
Yep.
You've set up some delectable dualities today, right? Like, premium is not faux luxury. That is primo. Both chef's Josh and I were giving you chef's kiss on that one. Experimentation is not the same as innovation. Like, chef's kiss to that. So thank you, sir. It's an education sitting down with you, and it has taken us far too long to get this interview on the calendar.
Well, it's, as someone that has listened to this show consistently for years, and I know the times that I've texted you guys and been like, you guys killed it. That was fantastic. Because what I hope more than, again, listeners, just understand this was me pandering to get on, basically. But no, what I believe, there's a lot of communication about, and a vast majority of it, I think, is actually quite good for what it's worth. I want to believe at a positive way that there is a lot of very good communication in whiskey, but I also think that there's an element of like, it is great to sort of peel back the curtain occasionally and just go like, hey, think about this, like give this a quick, roundabouts, in one ear and not necessarily quickly out the other, like actually sit and stew on it a little bit. And I think that if you whiskey drinker listener, go to your cupboard tonight and you look and you fashion yourself as someone that really cares about whiskey, you will likely see a cupboard full of people that also care and think about whiskey, because those things tend to be fairly magnetic in their attraction. Like I love going into retail shops. I find retail shopping for whiskey to be fascinating, because you can tell, very quickly, you can often tell who is being thoughtful in their approach, wanting to develop a premium, provide a value add, versus the things that are just sort of there because it's like, well, shit, no one said this wasn't a good idea, so we did it.
Yeah. Oh, man. I need to correct myself really quickly. I said we've never met in Connecticut. That was a flat-out lie.
Is that true?
You came to my 50th birthday party in Clinton.
Oh, Jesus Christ, we did. Yes.
We were all
That's 100%
together.
true. Are we considering, we were close enough to the ocean or the sound that we could have just said it was like very northern Long Island, but yeah, I think that has to count.
No, that has to count, and I want to, for 12 years, I had told this story. I've known Chris for X number of years, and we've never met in Connecticut. And I just got into a habit, and I'm telling the same old story. And now
I can't believe we both spaced on that. Frankly, all three of us, because literally the three of us were there together.
I'll take that as well. Yeah,
that doesn't. I got to tell you, the editors are going to need to catch that. But no, it's it's the best part of the industry. Everyone says this, but it really is the best part of the industry are the people. You meet so many tremendously cool people that all have a perspective and they have their own palates. And if you're lucky, they'll share with you some really cool perspectives, but also some really cool whiskey. I mean, we've definitely drank some incredible stuff together in the past, which is always the best part of it. I mean, Milk and Honey was introduced to me by you guys, and just being like, oh my God, like this is awesome. So I can't help but to smile at times, because it's like, man, in the billions of ways that my life could have kind of turned out, it's hard not to reflect and just go, my God, like, why have I been so deserving of such luck? I've worked hard. I'm not going to pretend like I haven't, but I got to tell you, you got to be really lucky to have it this good.
I just love the way you think about this industry, the way you talk about this industry, the way you celebrate this industry. You, sir, are a keeper of the highest order.
You're too kind.
I think that's a perfect place to end the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Like Jason had said, it's taken far too long, and given the quality of the conversation and just to see your face again, I kick myself in the ass that it's taken this long. And we need to... A, we'll have you back, and B, the three of us need to get together and do some good drinking.
100%.
Oh, in the spirit of the season, next year in Connecticut.
where it'll be the second time we've all gotten together.
What an absolutely brilliant conversation to be having with a good friend, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think... Do you remember back when Mark Watt, way back in the beginning of this, had asked the question, would you consume whiskey if it wasn't alcoholic?
Episode 4.
Lovely little question, and it pops into my head often, and there are definitely people I ask that of. I really meant it when I said I'd taken note of experimentation is not the same as innovation.
Right.
And our next episode is with James Saxon, and he 100% is getting asked that question. We will be discussing that in the next episode with James Saxon.
For the sake of some of our listeners, would you remind people who James Saxon is and what company he represents?
He is now the lead whiskey maker with Compass Box.
Amazing.
That's a big splash. That's
huge.
a really big splash for somebody that you and I have known for a dozen years.
Right.
Maybe longer.
Somewhere around the same amount of time as us knowing Chris Riesbeck, right?
Right.
There you go.
Right. It's very cool to have been in these whiskey circles this long that we're now seeing friends ascend to positions that were vaunted. You know, obviously remain, but I'm just saying from back when we were, you know, do you remember when you first met John Glazer?
When in person?
Well, in person, or what is it, tasting with them, or he presented?
Yeah, the first tasting the first time I met him was when we interviewed him at their offices. Like, I think you had done events with him before, but I hadn't had that experience prior.
Yeah. But do you remember being nervous to approach John Glazer?
Oh, hell
do you remember
yes.
thinking,
oh my gosh, yes. Yeah.
That's John Glazer, right over there. This is true for me back when I first made contact with John Campbell, right? That's John Campbell over there. I've said my story about Simon Brooking, right? Who's represented Lafroig and now Bowmore and Ardmore for so very, very long. And thinking, the first time you met those people, we've now got friends who are occupying these types of positions, being promoted to these types of positions. It's so cool. It's wonderful.
Cool.
And as excited as we were to finally get Chris Riesbeck on, I'm equally as excited to touch base with James again. The most James has had on One Nation Under Whiskey is a couple of bits, actually. He's had his own half episode.
Correct.
Which was fun back in the day. But he's also the oft-quoted originator of Single Cask Nation Cinematic Universe.
Cinematic Universe, yes. I love that.
And so he means a whole lot to us, as does Mr. Riesbeck here. So, yeah, it's very cool. We're swimming in some really excellent friend waters these days.
And what's nice is there's none of that, warm spots in the water either. You don't have to worry about that.
Purple dye being activated. Squirrels jumping in when you least expect it.
The goddamn squirrels, Jason. Goddamn squirrels. All right. You and I are going to do so. You and I, Jason. Imagine you and me. I do. Da, 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 da. You and I, Jason, are going to be
Beach
doing
Boys.
something that we don't often do.
Oh.
We are going to be talking.
Quit early?
We are going to be talking.
Quit while we're ahead? Not interrupt one another?
Help, I'm ahead. I need to quit. Yeah, exactly, right? Not interrupt one another. We are going to be talking exclusively about American spirits for the next segment, which I like to call the news segment.
Extra, extra! Read all about it! Life story of Playboy Penny! Extra, extra! Extra, extra! Read all about it! Me and that Playboy in trouble again!
since March, you and I, here in America,
Yep.
online,
Online.
have been releasing 3 casks a month. And we've done our mid-March launch. We've done our mid-April launch. Bottles remain on our website. If you're situated in America, please go, have a look over them, buy some, have them sent to your doorstep. We've mixed in a little bit of rum, a little bit of Australian rye, a little bit of Scotch, a little bit of kosher for Passover rum. For the months of May and June, we are turning our attention exclusively to the world of American spirits. And I put it to you, Joshua Hatton, this day,
All right.
that we are long established in this realm. And we have proudly represented this realm since the fall of 2013. You thought I was going to say the fall of Rome. We're old, but we're not that old. So I will say since the fall of 2013.
Yeah.
And at that time, we released a very special Whiskey Jubilee bottle.
Yeah.
That was a named 15-year-old Heaven Hill single cask.
Amazing. Yeah.
But while that kicked it all off, I thought 2014 was pretty cool. And I'm curious what you remember of 2014 and the releases we did then.
Well, that's an easy one. You know, releasing that Heaven Hill in 2013 was a significant point of pride because they came up to us and they said, you guys run the Jubilee. We're the Jewish-owned bourbon company. Why don't we work together? I think that was the first time, aside from the Isle of Arran distillery, where you know, a distillery reached out to us and said, we want to work with you. And what a cool thing to be doing, especially in those early days. And so getting to release that bourbon almost 11 years ago now, huge point of pride. In 2014, we really spread our wings when it came to American spirits because we followed that bourbon by a rye from Catoctin Creek. That was our 2-year-old.
Absolutely.
Right, from a white wine cask, and that continues to this day to be, you know, some of our nation members, you know, most favorite bottlings.
Absolutely.
Period.
Yep, absolutely.
That was then followed by 2 bottlings, and this is the history part of things that I really love. That was followed by 2 bottlings of American light whiskey from LDI. Now, whiskey,
not El Diablo.
not El Diablo, not El Jefe, but LDI and American whiskey archaeologists may know that history, right? Like MGP, which a lot of people know nowadays, distillery in Indiana, produces a lot of bourbon, produces the rye we all think about when we think of American rye, or what most people think about. You know, they were called Lawrenceburg Distillers, Indiana. And in 2014, we bottled 2 light whiskeys and put the distillery name on the label. We were the first bottler to do something like that.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. It's a funny compass box memory because John Glazer was at Whiskey Fest when they did the big Saturday rock show version thing.
Yeah.
But Robin Robinson was representing Compass Box as well. And Robin Robinson had said, the ball's on you guys. And I thought, oh no, he's coming in hot. What have we done? He said, you actually put LDI, Lawrenceburg Distillers, Indiana, on your label. Love it. Love it.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like, oh, we were just doing the Scottish traditional thing, which is they made it. They get their name on our label. Like, we didn't think we were doing a big thing at all. And for Robin to really see that and really celebrate us for doing that was very cool. That memory stands out for me.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And then following that, we bottled, I think, also in October, because you mentioned October 2013 for Heaven Hill. October 2014 had our 2-year-old heavily peated Westland in a sherry barrel. And so there we are. 11 years ago, we launched with a bourbon out of Kentucky, then a rye out of Virginia, 2 light whiskeys out of Indiana, and then an American single malt out of Seattle, Washington. This is 10, 11 years ago. And we had been championing American spirits ever since.
Oh, 100%. You just have to look at our archive to see that commitment. Right. But I also want to put another round of leaves on branches for the listeners. Was that Westland that you just speak about here, the heavily peated, heavily sherried, was our first go-around of some people are going to passionately love this and champion it and share it, and some people are going to hate this. And I'm okay with, we were okay with people hating it.
Yep.
It just wasn't a whiskey that was going to solicit a meh from anybody. That's neither here nor there on it.
Yep.
Right? It was our first foray into it's going to be okay if some of the nation don't purchase this. And even now saying that, it feels a little bit daring. It feels a little bit daunting. And that was us 2 years, 3 years into doing what we do with independent bottling.
Yeah.
And even the first time of telling the Westland story, right? Imagine coming out telling Westland, introducing Westland to people for the first time. And some people might go, oh no, when they've never been known for putting out heavily peated, heavily sherried.
Right? At all.
And yet they trusted us with that story and the nation enough to know that if that Westland wasn't for the nation, they would still pay attention to future Westlands that we were releasing for the nation.
Exactly.
And they absolutely have. The support for Westland in the nation is, I think, unsurpassed.
Well, with that in mind, we have 6 whiskeys coming. Let's talk about Westland first.
It was the first one being bottled of the 6.
Right. So regular listeners should remember, last year we did a live podcast at Westland Distillery. It was you, it was me, it was Jess flew out to be with us.
Unbelievable coming in from Glasgow for that.
Just amazing. But
she is a Westland nut. To be fair.
She is a Westland.
To be fair.
Right? If Kilhoman has Travis Williams as the biggest fan, Westland has Jess Lomas as the biggest fan. And so anyway, just prior to that live podcast recording, you, me, and Jess, along with about 25 other nation members, selected what has been bottled and what we're about to talk about now. Could you detail the details of this cask, Jason?
This is gosh, I was going to say a long-standing Westland, but I don't entirely know what that means. So I will say this is a well-aged Westland, where this was actually distilled September of 2014. And we're talking a Sauternes Barrique here, which is it's a remarkable marriage of the Westland 5 malt spirit with a wonderful, rich wine.
Yeah.
That you're traditionally more of a Sauternes guy than me.
Yeah, it's my favorite aside from like second fill bourbon for malt, which I really love. There's something about a Sauternes cask that I think works so well with so many different spirit types that I've often said Sauternes cask is my go-to cask type.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. And it's rich, it's warming, it's sweet, it's okay. It's doing everything you want a 5 malt that's meeting Sauternes to do. Very accessible strength, 52.3 is the cask strength on this. Yeah. Very accessible. ABV on that. I know Jess has an issue with accessible for a description of whiskies, and so me describing this Westland as accessible has probably got her screaming at her portable radio right now. But my apologies, Jess.
She's sending you some Morse code right now. Yeah, so that's super exciting. You know, there's something to be said about the casks that we pick, but then the cask that we pick as a nation community always has a certain feel to it. And I'm so thankful of so many people that came out, having that selection where a majority of people said all of these are good, but this one is the one that shines through. And this time around, it really was the majority that glommed onto this particular cask. It was just
no doubt about it. And full maturation. This is always something we end up saying in tastings and pourings. This is full maturation. This is not a finish.
Yep.
One of the finishing casks was involved in this selection process, but it was the full maturation that took the day, and that's exciting to me. My personal opinion is if you're going to put Westland 5 malt into Sauternes, go wholehearted. Right? Give it full maturation. Give it 9 years in that.
Yeah.
Let them spend the 9 years getting to know one another, battling it out, having their differences, coming together. Like, have a full life story on the back of that.
Yep.
So, yeah, you can tell I'm over the moon with this cask. I'm excited to get sampling this for people. I know it's going to resonate well.
So that's
with the nation.
So that is cask number 1 of 3 that we're releasing in May. What are the other 2 that we're releasing in May, Jason?
The second cask being released in May is our very first trip to Wilderness Trail.
Brilliant.
A distillery that was clearly in the news last year for obvious reasons. Editors note they were sold to Campari. They also have a tremendous following amongst bourbon fans. They are, to some people, a preeminent producer, despite being somewhat new on the scene. They certainly don't have the history of a Maker's Mark or Wild Turkey or anything like that, but they have hit the ground running. Their reputation for yeast.
Right? Which, Dr. Pat Heist.
For the nation, for whiskey geeks, to be known for your attention to detail on yeast, I think is a hell of an accolade. What a thing to be able to put on your calling card. So kudos to them there. That's going to be a 4-year-old Wilderness Trail rye with full maturation in a number 4 new charred oak. Is that number 4 char?
Yeah, it's a number 4 char.
Number 4
it is.
char on that new charred oak.
Yep.
One of the things you and I have done in the history of this company is we've always looked to zig where others have zagged. We're always looking to tell a slightly different story, and I definitely feel when we come into this rye story, this isn't like our backwoods heritage rye story where we talked about something that was quite rich and heavy and chocolatey. This, to me, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this as well, this is a rye that is zigging where other ryes zag. And I remember from our selection of this, talking about it being quite floral. There is definitely an oak presence, there's no doubt about it, with that number 4 char in there. But there's definitely a much softer rye happening here. Not particularly herbaceous,
correct,
right? Not necessarily dill forward. You were saying this a second ago about that known 95.5 from MGP. It's a different kind of rye, and I'd be curious of your recollection from the selection process.
Yeah, I found it to be a rye telling 2 unusual stories, in that it's clear the spirit character it's so strongly soft, if that makes sense. When you have a final spirit that has that lovely floral tone to it, delicate earthiness. Yes, it's herbaceous, but it's not dilly at all. It's got some spice, but it's not to the level that you think of when you think of Indiana rye. It's this more sort of floral, delicate, earthy style that holds its own against a number 4 char barrel, right?
Yeah.
That really is saying something. I think it talks to the quality of spirit that Dr. Pat Heist and the team there have developed. I think this is a very intentional whiskey. It knows what it's doing, and it tells you exactly what it's doing, which I quite like indeed.
I think intentionality is well used there. I think that's a smart comment. The other one that I was nodding my head to as you were saying it is delicate earthiness.
Yeah.
And the flavometer shows a 4 on that. It shows a 5 on spice.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily the expected rye spice.
Exactly.
I think there's an oak-driven spice there that then the rye spirit delivers the delicate earthiness in companionship there. Right?
There you go.
Yeah, the intentionality is a good comment there. And it's got one of those double-digit ABVs, 56.35, because you have to turn US proof into an ABV. So 56.35, wonderfully drinkable, wonderfully enjoyable, and certainly something we're excited to have our first offering from Wilderness Trail. It is definitely one of those distilleries we have been asked about as a distillery that we hadn't yet bottled from. So excited to get them into the single cask nation world.
And I know I asked you to mention the third release for May, but I'm a little too excited, so I want to do it, if you don't mind. I
can tell that from afar.
You could, even sitting down, you could tell how excited I am. We mentioned it a few times, right? LDI, MGP, we've bottled their bourbon, we've bottled their light whiskey, we've bottled their rye. This is our first time bottling a wheated bourbon from MGP, and what I love about this particular one is, how do I say this? Right? There's certain casks of whiskey that sometimes just take you by surprise. And you say, wait a second, what is this? What is happening? Why is this flavor in here? And there's a delicate, smoky quality to this wheated bourbon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Say
more about that. Now that I'm interrupting you, say more about that.
Well, it almost reminds me of a cask strength version of High West Campfire, right? Where you've got that bourbon quality coming through. You've got some delicate spice coming through. But then from out of the blue, there's this smoke. And there's no peating happening at MGP. There's no. Could it be the wood char? Because this, has a good oak presence to it. Maybe, I don't know, but it's one of those ones where we said, if the remit of an independent bottler is to show people examples of a distillery that they can't find elsewhere, boom, job done. This is just remarkable liquid that will take you by surprise, and it's one of those ones where you want to open it and you want to share it and you want to talk about it.
To all of those points, I wish to add our label note that will be on every label that is on a bottle that arrives at every nation home that acquires this. We have written an atypical bourbon from this well-regarded producer. Pronounced smoky cask char is balanced by cherries, buckwheat honey, and funnel cake. The spice builds but never overwhelms, and the spent charcoal complements the generous sweetness.
Oofty.
That's why we selected this cask.
There you go. Right?
35 words on why we selected this cask. It is a home run, but the emphasis is on atypical.
Yeah.
And if we're going to go with the Wilderness Trail being intentional, I would suggest this MGP wheated bourbon is fortuitous.
Oof. Chef's kiss, Jason. Chef's kiss.
Thank you. It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful and does things that you and I did not expect when we opened the sample.
Yep. Yeah, and it's, you know, you and I talk about it quite often. We love bourbon. We love what bourbon can do. And we love bourbon because it is so bourbony. I love this bourbon because it takes you outside of the typical bourbon
100%.
flavor silo that you find yourself in, right? So
100%. Absolutely. And you and I said exactly that when we were selecting it.
Yeah. Yep. So that's May. Let's get our June selections in here really quickly, because I know our listeners are really keen to hear about it, but we also need to get out of here. So
I think that's a very fair comment.
So
let's
go ahead.
I'm going to give you the lead on the first mention here.
Yeah. So listeners may remember, and Nation members should surely remember, we've bottled Black Button before, and that one was actually, it was a marriage of 4 23-gallon casks. It was using a special yeast that they don't often use, and it was just a great sort of marriage of casks, and I think highlighted, you know, that sort of big spicy element that you can often get from Black Button. And
if I may interject for just 1 second on that very topic of yeast, and we just talked about it with Wilderness Trail there, is Black Button normally use a champagne yeast.
Yes.
And in the instances of these casks that we acquired, they used a bourbon yeast. Talk about zagging when a distillery zigs.
Right. Yeah. Right in that way.
Maybe we zigged when they zagged.
Yeah.
Who knows? But what an interesting yeast to be talking about, right?
Right. Yeah.
Bourbon in a bourbon instead of champagne.
Right. Yeah. Which is an interesting story to tell, because usually that's a non-story, but in this case, it was a story. So this time around, we bottled a single cask, and this was from a 30-gallon cask. We've purchased a number of casks from Black Button, and we've been sort of just watching them along the way. And this one, 30-gallon, we bottled at 7 years of age, 51.1% alcohol. And this one's a small outturn. This one's 124 bottles. But one of the things that I like about it, and when I say one of, because there are many things that I like about this, is when you look at the flavometer, the rich on the flavometer equals that of the oakiness. It's a 7 out of 10. This is a big, rich, oaky bourbon. It's got a 5 on the earthy, so it's got some good depth and heft to it, and there's a sweetness to it as well, right? It's a 5 on the sweetness. So, you know, this bourbon is doing a lot of things, and I think about our Nation members who like well-aged bourbons where the oak is doing a bit more talking. If you really like those more oaky bourbons without it overtaking, because you and I talked about this, right? Astringency and wood tannins blow out my palate. This is balanced quite nicely. This is about as extreme oak as I can handle on a bourbon, and it's still quite balanced.
Very much so, yeah. We wouldn't go to the extremes of a blowout char or blowout tannin or blowout oak.
That's not what we do.
We would still, we'd still need the balance, and you correctly say this remains balanced. Really happy and excited to get Black Button in front of the Nation again. That's, as you say, a couple of years now since we've put that out there. So, and a single cask and not a small batch. So number of nice little differences here that have connective tissue to our first release, but it gets to be its own story, its own release from that distillery.
Yep. Yeah, so that's Black Button, and then should we do another B? Let's do another B.
Well, we're representing the BBC in April, so
we are doing the BBC.
Yeah, and I think this Balcones is another one that will show a different side of a distillery. Mm-hmm. And it's, if you could talk to somebody about a number 3 char Balcones, you might think, Texas Sun, Texas Maturation, number 3 char. There's Golden Promise malted barley here that is bringing so much to the table. And just like we talked previously about being able to stand up to the oak, this Golden Promise does a lovely job of standing up to the oak. It also stands up to the ABV, which I am very pleased to say, because I know the nation champs at the bit for ABVs like this. Yeah. We are talking 64.15% on this.
I love it.
Like, this is a big make the nation happy ABV with wonderful spirit at that strength.
And the flavometer on the label shows off something we've never done before, ever. When we look at the richness scale on the flavometer, a 9 out of 10. A 9 out of 10. The sweet on it, an 8 out of 10. Right? With the oakiness being a 6 out of 10, which shows you just how flavorful that spirit is, right? That Golden Promise malt is doing a lot of heavy lifting, delivering that sweetness, delivering that depth of flavor, that richness and character.
Yeah, and this is definitely one for Balcones fans. It's also one for single malt fans looking to see what else can happen in Texas with Balcones. And some phrasing that the nation is going to hear from us. Dark and decadent, spicy yet sweet, and with a finish that attaches itself to the roof of your mouth and refuses to let go. We wrote that the day we selected this cask so that we would not forget that that's how we want to talk about this whiskey to the nation. It's a very special Balcones.
Absolute cracker. And in our second Balcones at that, right? So we talk about our second Black Button, now our second Balcones. Now we're about to talk about now we'll talk about
math on the fly.
Is this our 5th Catoctin Creek?
So this is our 4th Catoctin Creek, but fits in the SCN cinematic universe perfectly. What we did here was a few years ago, we took 2 30-gallon casks. We poured them into an ex-Kilchoman hogshead. We then had 2 empty casks. We took them both off to Rocket Frog, a brewery owned and operated by a long-time nation member, David Hartogs and his brother.
Indeed.
I'm not going to say what they were both used for. I'm going to talk about one of them right now. This cask was used to hold barley wine. The barley wine was tipped. The empty cask went back to Catoctin Creek and we put new make spirit into said cask. And we have been sitting on said cask since, checks notes, October 2020. So we have ourselves a 3-year-old ex-barley wine Catoctin Creek rye that has never seen the inside of new charred oak.
Which I love that you say that, because I've never been as excited to write a spirit style on the label until I wrote this spirit style on the label. So listeners likely know this, but for legally for rye whiskey to be called rye whiskey, that spirit needs to have spent some time in new charred oak cask, in a cask that's never been used before. But because this cask had been used to produce barley wine, and this spirit spent all of its time in that cask and never any time in new charred oak, the spirit type is not called rye whiskey. It's whiskey distilled from a rye mash.
Brilliant.
It's the most unsexy term, and I fucking love it.
Oh, yeah. No, it's... The Catoctin Creek rye is driving this party.
Yes.
The fact that it's never seen new charred oak means we can't call it rye whiskey. More than happy to leave that Catoctin Creek rye driving this party.
I'm not going to put us up there with Compass Box and the John Glazers of the world, but there's something about this where we put that whiskey distilled from rye mash that it makes me think of their 3-year-old deluxe, where it was 97% 37-year-old Klein Leash with some other bits and bobs, and just a dash of 3-year-old because we have to call it 3-year-old. Your point is a very good one. This is rye whiskey, and the rye is loud and proud, but we can't call it rye whiskey because of the cask type that has been used.
Right, and listen, regulations are important. Regulations are useful. Regulations drive categories. However, we could have walked this whiskey from a pallet in cask to a bottling machine in a charred oak bucket, and we could have called this rye whiskey. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So, there are ways to game a system. We have made a decision that is, we don't want to game the system. We want to play by the rules, but we want to tell the nation the full transparent story here. There you go. And this is a 30-gallon ex-barley wine cask. I am going to own that very happily. Very, very happily. And the nation can taste that for themselves. They can see what they think of that. Take note, because it is 30-gallon cask, the outturn is down on this. 118 anticipated bottles. That's what we've got on the label. So I think it's going to go quite quickly with the love that the nation has for Catoctin Creek and the expectations they've got for it. Let me give you just a little bit that draws my attention that we'll be talking about. And I remember when you and I selected this, we confirmed that this was going to go into bottle. I talked about a soft rye bread note.
Oh, yeah.
And you in the moment were like, yes, it's both soft and it is rye bread. Yeah, it's Arnold's. Which got us talking about Jess. And there's a Finnish distillery that she is very fond of, and they are known for rye bread elements. And so I think rye bread is worth discussing as we go forward here, what's seeking out here. But what an absolutely wonderful addition to a June lineup. And just to recap, because Nation members have been asking us, what's coming down the line? Can you give us a bit more of a peek into the future? And so here we've got May, Westland 9-year-old full maturation and Sauternes, a Wilderness Trail rye that's 4 years old in number 4 char, an MGP wheated bourbon that's 7 years old from a number 4 char with number 2 char heads.
Oh, that's right.
There's an interesting story to get into as well, right? That's May. June, Balcones Golden Promise malted barley, 4 years old, number 3 new charred oak. Black Button, 30-gallon, right? With that bourbon yeast going on there. We've been watching this cask for years. And then an ex-barley wine, 30-gallon Catoctin Creek rye mash bill. Oh, yes.
Yep.
Yes, and yes. So there you go. Things to look out for, things that we remain excited about. And this American spring, bring them in for your July 4th celebrations. Celebrate America. Celebrate America with us. We've been doing this since 2013.
Right.
Let's keep doing it.
Keep doing it. I love that. There you go. Oof. Long may it continue, Jason.
Heck yeah. I've got no plans to stop.
So I just want to remind listeners before we get out of here that we'd love to receive your questions. And again, whether it's for me and Jason, or it's for directed at Jess or Steve or what have you, we'd love to hear from you. Info@singlecastnation.com or questions@onenationunderwhiskey.com. And listen, if you love this podcast, please do a couple things. Tell your friends about it. You know, if they love whiskey or if they're curious to get into whiskey, you know, hopefully there are enough episodes that will be a good resource for them. And
I think your use of hopefully.
and then also just, you know, head over to Apple Podcasts. Give us a shiny review. We'd love 5 stars. We'd love all the nice words being written about us. And if you,
it's fun to read those as well.
And that's
share those with the listeners.
Say. Oh, Jason, you're so good. That's what I was going to say. If you do that, we'll read what you write on the podcast about the podcast. We'll read what you write about the podcast on the podcast.
It's very meta. It is. It becomes real meta real fast.
Should we listen to the podcast while we read what people wrote about the podcast on the podcast? At what time do we break the fourth wall?
I'm just imagining Russian dolls of situations now.
It's totally
like
Russian.
It's a podcast.
Gotta get up, gotta get out.
It's a podcast within a podcast, within a pidcast, within a podcast. It unravels real fast. But yes, please communicate.
So listen, thanks once again to Chris Riesbeck. Chris, really
100%.
Really lovely having you on. Listeners, please check in 2 weeks when we have James Saxon, who is now the head whiskey maker at Compass Box. He'll be on our next episode. And with that, Jason, I'm going to say cheers to you, to Chris, and of course, to the listeners. Ooh, I like that. Dink.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode. You paused for just long enough.
I was going to do like a Bane one. You know, like a hello everybody. But I'm not going to do that.
Should do it more like the dwarf from Twin Peaks.
Was he the one that talked in reverse? Would he say "I'm the arm"?
But he was all...
Yes.
I can't even imagine showing that to my boys. I think they would just be like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen, and none of it makes any sense. They love things to make sense.
How did anybody greenlight any of that?
I know, right? For network TV.
Yeah.
Like,
fucking
anyway.
wild.
All right,
Anyway.
go for it, Joshua. I'm focused. I'm on board,
All right.
please.